Welcome back to another episode of FPOG, Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals. This week on the podcast, we want to tackle an investment topic, and we want to talk about ESG. ESG investing is it's not new. It's been around for a while. It's also been around in previous formats and different names in the past. But it's an important topic because I think every investor and I think every investment firm needs a well thought out answer to the question, do you invest in ESG funds? Do you allocate your portfolio to ESG in any way, shape, or form? And we do have a guest on the podcast this week. We have Rusty Gilbert with us. And we're excited to hear from Rusty's perspective on all things ESG. And he's had a long, excellent career in the oil and gas space. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you, Rusty. Would love to hear a little bit about where you're coming from and what does your background look like?
Yeah, Justin, thanks a lot for that. I'm currently living in Houston, and I've got an energy advising firm called Gilbert Energy, and it's a broad space, right? Energy, it's not only for renewables and transitional energy, but also oil and gas and the ESG topics, which we'll cover today. I've worked in the technology field a lot of my career. I worked in tech ventures at the end of my career before I started up this advising service, and I've worked in upstream, which is basically finding oil and gas deposits not only in the United States but around the world, onshore and offshore, and had a brief stint in the Department of Environmental Protection back in my home state of New Jersey. Thanks.
That's fantastic. And with that being said, we'll just dive in. So I'm really excited to just get your thoughts on a handful of different questions pertaining to ESG. So to kick it off, short term, long term, is ESG a net positive or negative?
The best way to answer that, it's a net positive, both short and long term. Everyone has to be concerned about ESG, the environmental impact, the society effects, and of course the governance to make sure it happens. I think where some groups start to deviate is perspective and how much. Are they all in? Are they partially in? And what are the financial implications and economic implications for the decisions associated with ESG?
Absolutely. And I'm interested in your perspective and some of the work you do now, just in terms of how does a company hit ESG metrics, and what does it take? Why are some oil and gas companies in the club? They're in ESG. You look at an ESG index, they're in the index. Why are others out? So how hard is it to hit ESG metrics?
What all companies are grappling with right now, both in oil and gas and outside. But if we focus on the energy side for that question, the European companies were actually maybe a little bit ahead of the game, in part based on the policies that they had in place and the initiatives that they had in place. I think the U.S. companies are catching up, that maybe they've actually caught up to the European companies relative to the focus on improving their ESG metrics. We have a lot of different energy companies, right, in the United States, and both big and small and in between, and they're all different. They have different philosophies and cultures. I think the larger companies, bought in a bit early compared to maybe some of the other size companies, but there's some leaders and there's some followers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And do you think that, you see some U.S. companies, some European companies adhering to ESG more than others? Do you think we're ever going to see Russia, China, Saudi Arabia come close to adhering to different ESG metrics?
Those countries you mentioned, they're, in my view, right, and in some of my peers, they're talking the right game, but they're not actually, doing what they probably need to be, that needs to be done. they're doing it at a different pace than what's occurring in the United States and what's occurred in say in Western Europe. Some of those countries are doing a little bit better job than others, but many of them are not adhering to the metrics that the U.S. based and Western European countries have laid down. So it's a little bit of an unfair playing field right now with who's doing what. And to some extent, I think the U.S. companies are having to foot the bill at a higher cost to find and produce when some of these other countries are kind of ignoring what ESG metrics have been established in a country like the United States.
Certainly. And I'm curious, when a company's trying to hit metrics, obviously a large publicly traded company has a big incentive to be in an index. And so if iShares or if anyone is making an ESG index, there's certainly an incentive for every company to try to get in. But with that ESG metrics that they're having to pass, how much is on the E, how much is on the S, and how much is on the G?
Yeah, well, it kind of varies by company, I think, and by the company's culture. But I think in general, right, and I've worked within these companies for a long time and worked with these companies for a long time. I think they were always in. They were never really out. Now there's some exceptions to that with some smaller operators that we heard stories about that, but eventually kind of business caught up with them. It's just more of a focus now, and I think with the focus, in order to show improvement, you've got to be able to measure. So the metrics are really important. They're setting metrics for years out for being, say, at net zero, but they've actually have to measure what their emissions are today and tomorrow to be able to determine how much they are improving and can they actually hit those targets. I think some of the companies sincerely believe they can hit those targets. I think there's going to be a huge challenge with those companies getting to net zero without purchasing, say, a lot of carbon offset credits, which is part of the business right now with purchasing carbon credits, right, to help bring their credit score down to a net zero.
I'm glad you mentioned carbon offsets, and we didn't even discuss this topic beforehand. But if it's okay with you, Rusty, I'm interested to get your thoughts. When a company is purchasing carbon offsets, I'm trying to phrase this in not too much of a negative way, but it's easy to look at carbon offsets as kind of a tricky accounting gimmick, and to kind of say, well, how valuable is a carbon offset? And could you kind of tell us a little bit, is there kind of a range of some carbon offsets are legitimately very good and benefit society as a whole, and others are a little more hollow? What's your thoughts on just carbon offsets in general?
This is a very interesting topic, and I can't claim to be an expert in it, but it was interesting enough. The call before this, I was on a very, very good call and discussion around carbon offset and carbon credits, and I think the speaker was pretty well on. So if I can summarize a little bit of that and also what I know, it's an independent accounting tool to be able to monetize saving carbon. And since the oil and gas companies are basically in a upstream, midstream, downstream business, most of them, upstream being finding and producing, midstream being the transportation of mostly pipelines, and the downstream, the refining for the oils and natural gas and gasoline products and jet fuels that they make. They're big emitters. I mean, everybody recognizes that. So I like to look at it as an opportunity to get better and to clean up their operation, because we can, put scrubbers on the stacks and remove the CO2 and sequester the CO2 or make it into a different type of product. Even if they, are able to do as much as they're trying to do in the years ahead, they're going to probably have to buy carbon offsets and carbon offset credits to be able to get their scores down, because they just can't get low enough without purchasing them. So there's a scramble right now. Where's the source of carbon credits? And there's not enough of them, but it's a growing source. And then the cost of those credits, right, are going up. So in a way, it's a tax on the producers, because now they have to pay increasing amounts of money for these carbon offsets, and it's going to be higher a few years from now than it is right now. But some of the examples are, and some of them are good ones, right? Some of them you have to kind of maybe blink a couple times, but they're shutting down some coal mines because you have methane gas emitting from coal mines, or some of the vents that they established to be able to do the mining. Livestock is one of the topics with methane emissions. Some of the carbon offset credits come from, don't cut down trees that you plan to cut down for this purpose or that purpose. And then establishing, renewable energy sources like wind farms or solar farms, instead of having oil or natural gas to generate electricity, or just some of the examples that are being used for their carbon offset credits.
That makes sense. And I mean, it sounds like there is just a really wide spectrum of what a carbon offset can be. I'm in a few different focus groups with other certified financial planners that own investment firms. And, there have been cases, this hasn't happened, in our firm, but there have been cases where clients of other investment firms have been contacted by a company trying to purchase carbon offsets. And this particular person was contacted because they happen to own a lot of land that has a lot of trees. And the person was not planning on cutting down these trees anyway. And Corporation X wanted to write them a small check to not cut down their trees, which was already, they weren't going to cut down the trees for a long period of time. And so, it's examples like that feel just kind of like company X is paying individual Y to do something that individual Y is already going to do that has nothing to do with company X.
For me, it kind of spoils the legitimacy, right, of what the industry needs to do and what the direction should be, instead of making things up, um, if that's how you want to describe it, right, to gain some offset credits that they can then use to improve their score. So, but right now, I mean, those are the rules, and how it goes. People, when you set out the rules, people follow, the rules. And right now, not cutting down trees is part of it. But I'm not a big supporter of that aspect of it.
I think that's such a good point. And one, where we're going to eventually get to with this conversation is what are some things and what are some just brainstorming, what are ways that ESG could be better, and what are ways that it could, because it's such a politicized topic, and it's easy to have a conversation about ESG and immediately, have it be a little bit of a polarized debate. But there's some parts of ESG that 90% of people look at and think, hey, we could sharpen this. And there is, a weak spot here. And so, yeah, I think that's a great thought, and we'll certainly get into that topic here in a second. Rusty, if it's okay with you, I'm interested to go back to Russia, China, Saudi Arabia. So you mentioned that it is, they're playing on a little bit of a different playing field, and it is a little bit easier for them to produce some forms of energy that are more difficult for US, Europe, and regions that are closely adhering to ESG standards. Well, first of all, I think the pessimist would look at this scenario and say, well, hey, if the whole world is not going to adhere to environmental standards, then we're all sharing one world here. Aren't we kind of spinning our wheels if we're going to play by one standard, but a massive part of the world is just going to ignore it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought out the topic, and both of us, I think, can contribute to this podcast and in this space. But I'm a big believer that we're breathing the same air, right? And to some extent, we're fishing in the same ocean waters that are, circulating. Everybody's responsible here, and everybody needs to do their part. Now, the Paris Accord, which a lot of people default to, and I should have probably read up more on the Paris Accord before we had this podcast, but I'll let the listeners kind of do that and make some of their own decisions. My understanding is how they wrote that it's not an even playing field, right? They're putting more of the burden on the developed countries, and the quote unquote developing countries like China, etc. Get a big pass on what they're able to do, and countries like China and India are really big polluters of our earth, our air, our water. And a lot of the electrical power that gets generated in those countries is from coal. And coal, although, maybe 150 years ago in our country, started out as a resource, we quickly converted over to oil and then natural gas. And our CO2 emissions, and this is, this is data you can find just about anywhere. I'll be glad to forward it to any listener. Is our CO2 emissions as a country, USA, have gradually reduced year by year since about 2005. And it's largely because we started phasing out coal-fired electrical power plants and replaced them with natural gas-fired power plants. So our CO2 emissions are down from 2005 on a steady stream, and we're at about the 1990 level right now. Now, half of the CO2 emissions in the world are caused by coal-fired power plants, and there's not a big change that's undergoing right now to change that trajectory. So if we could do more on a worldwide basis to eliminate the coal power plants, we would make a more significant win in the CO2 emission space than trying to electrify everything here in the United States and paying a heavy price for the cost of all this conversion. Some of it's good and some of it's needed, but these mandates that are occurring, state by state, in some cases even at the federal level, are really going to hurt our economy.
That makes a great deal of sense. And, I'm interested when you talk about the landscape being different across different regions, different countries. Obviously, there is a lot going on geopolitically in Eastern Europe right now. And besides the war in Ukraine, we're also on the brink of a potential energy crisis. And we may not be on the brink, it may already be here. And so I'm interested. Is it fair? I think an ESG pessimist could look at the current situation and they could say, "Hey, ESG has kind of gotten us to this situation where Europe is really vulnerable, and now they're in an energy crisis." What are your thoughts there? Is it fair to partly blame ESG for some of those shortcomings that Europe is now experiencing?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up this topic, and not all the listeners are going to agree, but maybe it'll make them think a little bit, right? And maybe that's what the purpose of these podcasts kind of are. I made a few LinkedIn posts, over the last 6 months or so to basically support, what you summarized, that really Western Europe backed themselves into a corner with their policies that they formed going back to 10 years ago. It's been a gradual, slippery slope for them, going all green, doing away with oil and gas as a natural resource base. And they've largely failed. Even before the war in Ukraine, their energy costs were starting to get out of control with just depending more and more on wind and solar, which I think can be part of the mix. But the mandate that it has to be renewables is just the poor direction to go. And then when the Ukraine war hit, it just emphasized that point even more, because most of the natural gas that Germany and Western Europe receives comes from Russia. So they were improving their carbon scores in part because they weren't producing oil and gas, but they were importing it and improving their scores and saying, well, we import this natural gas, but what we're really generating here locally are more and more green energy sources, namely wind. And it's always been a fear that, look, Russia, they're not a fair player, right? They're a very evil empire, and I think if you're in Ukraine right now, you'd probably agree. If you're out of Ukraine, you might have mixed opinions, but they've been terrible, to the Ukrainian people, and now that they've predictably, I think predictably, cut off Nord Stream 1, which has been in operation for quite a number of years, not only to Germany, but, different parts of Western Europe. Uh, they've cut it off, and they were trying to fill their natural gas reserves, which is a normal process, even here in the United States, right? We produce natural gas during the course of the year or import it and put it in strategic reserves, usually underground caverns, salt domes sometimes. And because our energy usage for natural gas goes up for the heating during the winter, and those reserves aren't filled, they actually filled them more than they thought they would. So they might make it through this winter without literally, freezing to death. But it's unclear whether they'll make it through a winter, and largely it depends on whether it's going to be a cold winter or not.
Certainly. And yeah, I think they're in such a vulnerable position in many ways because they don't have the power, they don't have control over their own energy sources to the degree that they would.
They're importing a lot of LNG right now at a super high cost, and a lot of that's coming from the United States. So they're paying a huge, uplift because it costs a lot to convert natural gas to LNG. Then you have to convert it again once you get to the other side back to natural gas. So it's an expensive process, and those tankers are specialized where they have to cool the natural gas to turn it into a liquid to be able to transport it. So there's a lot of costs associated with the LNG, and Europe's paying the price right now.
Absolutely. And it leads me into really the question that I'm most excited to get your thoughts on. And after I hear your thoughts, I want to give you some of my thoughts and have you give me some feedback on them. But the most exciting question is if you could change ESG. And I mentioned this a few minutes ago. I think 90% of people, Republicans and Democrats, can agree that there are some big faults with ESG. So if you could change some things with it to make it a long-term positive force, what parts of it would you change?
Like you say, both sides. If we're talking politics, and there's people in the middle too. But I think everyone kind of embraces ESG. It's at what cost to not only themselves but to their country and the economy, and it's not explained really well by our leadership, right? We don't have good leaders right now, unfortunately. They're very politicized, and they're providing people misinformation. They're twisting the truth a lot. In some cases, not telling the truth to get their political agenda through, instead of getting some rational leaders in place that understand some aspects of the science, some aspects of the economy, and of course an appreciation for what ESG can do and the direction that we need to go with ESG, so we don't go backwards, right? I think there's a risk that if you try to push too hard and mandate, too many green energy sources, it's going to backfire, and we're already starting to see that right now, right? There's not enough lithium being produced in the world to make all the lithium batteries for the EVs. And we're going to have huge supply chain management disruptions with the EV market, not only for the batteries that aren't going to be able to be produced, but for some of the other components that depend on rare, valuable metals. And the mining industry is having to jumpstart and produce. I was looking at some data right before this podcast. Depends on what metals you're really talking about, right? Lithium, magnesium, or manganese, and there's cobalt. There's a few key components. in the EV sector, they're going to have to increase by anywhere from 2 to 10 times to meet the market demands. And that's going to be very disruptive to the environment, even if you can find those deposits, because a lot of it is surface mining. And some of those mines are not in very nice countries. So they've got, they don't have child labor laws and they don't have environmental laws like the United States. So we might buy our shiny new EV that might be colored green, but you have to dig down into the layers of where those products came from and what ESG components you can trace back to where those countries are that produce those raw materials. And that picture isn't being explained very well.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a ton of sense. And here's my 2 cents on one thing that maybe controversial. Maybe some people love it, maybe some people don't. I think one way to make ESG better is focus on the E, and instead of lowering carbon footprint, remove carbon offsets potentially entirely. So maybe it's not a measure of carbon activity, but instead it's a measure of we are going to use this amount of fossil fuels. So you get rewarded, you get a plus ESG score if it is produced, manufactured, delivered upstream, midstream, downstream, the whole process, if it's done with higher standards.
Yeah, I think that should be the focus, right? Reward the credible operators that are out there, producing hydrocarbons in a credible way without emitting or at least lowering their emissions in the refining sector, right? Trying to recover all their CO2, sequestering it beneath the ground, and not try to just do this mass substitution, which we're just not ready for, is an economy or even on the raw material side. But it's going to come to a huge cost to the individuals and the taxpayers, and not everybody are going to be able to afford this cost of change at the rapid pace that it's going at right now.
Certainly. And you take it a step further, and in reality, there's the desire for rapid change, and actions are happening to try and move toward rapid change, but rapid change isn't actually happening. Demand for fossil fuels isn't actually going down at all. And so if we need the same amount, producing and the entire process being done with higher standards seems like a win for everyone.
It's a win for everyone. And, if you look at these developing countries, right, they're most likely, unless there's some huge technology innovation breakthroughs that really aren't on the horizon, for I know some companies are trying to come up with different kind of batteries, and they eventually might get there. But these developing countries are going to be using fossil fuels in their transportation system and in their manufacturing base. We would be a leapfrog ahead if we could just get some of these countries off using coal and getting them to switch to natural gas and reducing the CO2 emissions and improving, the ESG scores for everyone.
Absolutely. And it is interesting to me to see some of what's happening in Europe. When you have an ESG conversation, I think there's extremes on both sides of the aisle that will have opinions on it. And it's easy for some people to say, well, this is a disaster. It's going in the wrong direction. But I do think that almost everyone in the world is concerned at some level on the E part. Everyone is concerned on the environmental part because we no longer want to tear down entire forests and produce energy that way. But it's also ironic that, well, that's exactly what part of Europe is doing right now. It has regressed.
It's regressed. Yeah, I think if you go too fast, you're actually going to see regression instead of progression. And I'm kind of with you, right? The E is something that everybody can rally behind, and not only for the time period we're here, but and I know you've got kids, right? I've got kids that are now adults and grandkids, so we want this earth to be a good place to live. But the data on like even the CO2 emissions is getting not publicized very well, and we've made great strides and progress here in the United States. Yet for some reason, right, we continue to get punished by saying, oh, not good enough. So no matter what we do, right, it's not good enough. And I'm okay for making progression, but it shouldn't be at a huge cost to us when these other countries are just looking the other way and we're breathing the same air.
Absolutely. And I want to finish by taking a minute or two and wrapping up and giving my thoughts on why we do not include ESG funds in our portfolios right now. And so, what I want to do is, it's easy to view this with a political lens. It's easy to view this with an environmental lens, but I want to instead view it from hey, I own a registered investment advisory firm. People pay me to be a fiduciary and build portfolios and properly manage portfolios. So I'm just going to spend 60 seconds, take you under the hood of why we don't include ESG funds in our portfolio right now. And the quick thoughts on that are, I do see enormous holes. I do see it as a politicized tool when it really should not be. I think the last 12 months have also unearthed the fact that, hey, Europe went down this road and now they are doing things that even the most right-winged, oil and gas person would look at and say, what in the world are you doing? And their power sources are incredibly not clean right now. And so it has experienced that regression. And so I think to a certain extent, it's really played a negative role and pushed us back. We will link to some of his work, but Aswath Damodaran is a professor at NYU Stern, and he has some excellent thoughts on ESG investing. But, he makes the point that it's almost as if we're just taking the same amount of fossil fuels and we're pushing it behind the curtain and we're pretending as if it now no longer exists. And when you push something behind the curtain, a lot of times the standards are not nearly as high. And so those are some of the thoughts, but really, I want to really specific get the investment glasses on now. One of my beefs. So iShares, Vanguard, every massive asset manager across the globe has some sort of ESG offering for the most part. And one thing we talk about with fund selection. So if you're building a portfolio and you're looking to add an ETF or a mutual fund, you always want to watch out for, is this a closet index fund? So is this a actively managed ETF or mutual fund where the provider might charge 1% as a management fee every year on it? But in reality, it looks 97% the same as IVV, which is iShares S&P 500 index ETF. And in many ways, ESG can have a lot of that. It can be a very similar wrapper, and it can look it can look real similar to an index, and you might just be paying 0.6% instead of 0.05%. And quick math on this, hey, if you've got a $5 million portfolio and the expense ratio on your funds are 0.2, 0.3, 0.4% higher, we're now talking about thousands of dollars in investment costs. And I think that there's got to be some changes made to even begin to come close to warranting a higher price in a portfolio. And so, when we think about, well, what's the right decision from the investment firm? What would a fiduciary do as we build, monitor, manage a portfolio? And we've come to the conclusion that we cannot warrant the additional fees, and that the benefit is not there for the additional costs that are always passed down to the end investor. And that's a long rambling answer, but I want to include that in this podcast.
So you're seeing the added cost even on the that aspect of the investment side, which is an interesting take on this.
It really is. And it's something to consider. You think about a company like iShares. If they can move clients from IVV, which is a pure S&P 500 fund, if they can move them from that to an ESG version of US large cap space, and if they can charge 0.4% instead of 0.04%, that moves the needle in a big way. That's a moneymaker for iShares, but it's not necessarily in the best interest of the end investor.
Right. We're seeing the same thing on the investment side of these smaller startups. The renewable transitional energy startups are getting very high premiums compared to, say, oil and gas, advanced technologies that are just getting overlooked and not even funded. And it's where the investment community is at right now, unfortunately.
That is fascinating. And when you say that, it kind of reminds me of all of those graphs that really were popular in 2019 to 2021, when you would see, Netflix, Salesforce, or a random tech company is now 10 times the market capitalization of ExxonMobil or Chevron. And you're just thinking, boy, how is that possible?
Right. You're lucky if, one of them, gets to one of those evaluations in a portfolio bundle. And many of them, may never become commercialized, but, a lot of money is being invested in some of these startup companies that if they had the oil and gas label, would be much, much lower for the investor.
Very interesting. Yeah, really appreciate that perspective. And Rusty, as we close here at the end, where can our listeners find you? You mentioned that you make some posts on LinkedIn.
Yeah, you can find me in a number of different places. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me under my name. I go by Rusty, but my real name's John. Last name obviously is Gilbert. I've got a website, jaragilbertenergy.com. You can find me there, and I'll be glad to interact with you if you got some questions or you want my perspective on something. Be glad to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Rusty. Really enjoyed chatting with you. And to our listeners, if you have questions or ideas for future episodes, podcast at brownleewealthmanagement.com.